Buonasera, signori e signori. Buonasera, signori e signori.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
It is a great pleasure for me to open this afternoon session, which is the second part concerning the topic of the diffusion of alternative currencies. In this session, we will have two papers from our French colleagues. Then we will make a short break of about 15 minutes, and after this, start the discussion. I hope this organization is okay for you and that we can come to an end of our session latest at 5 o'clock. Our first speaker is Matthieu Scherman from the University Gustave Eiffel de Champs-sur-Marne, and he will speak about il baratto, monetizzato tra grandi mercanti, pratica comune nel Cinquecento secolo. Matthieu, it's your floor.
Grazie mille. Anche se non ci siamo messi d'accordo con Francesco, mi sa che le cose tornano.
I think that everything will be perfect. In a letter from Barcelona to Florence in May 1462, Jacopo Pandolfini writes to Pier Filippo Pandolfini and his brothers to warn them not to barter cloth because there was some dispute in the city. The information was sent shortly before Catalonia became part of civil war and shows the common practice of barter in those places where large mercantile or important mercantile families had privileged positions. It was a common way of exchange, frequently reported by merchants' handbooks from the 15th and 16th century. In his famous work that we saw this morning, Luca Pacioli shows 9 ways of trading, among which we find barter. These activities are to be frequently found in the accounting books of important merchants from the Italian peninsula, and in particular from Florence. They were famous for their accounting and technical knowledge.
Utilizzato per la tenuta della contabilità.
For example, the double entry system is an evidence of their so-called modernity. Therefore, it is interesting to examine this kind of business by exchanging commodities instead of paying in cash or using accounting systems for accounts to be settled. I will take as an example, and this example has been mentioned already, family Salviati in Florence. This family is a privileged observatory thanks to the preservation of very important accounting books, in particular those about the agency opened in London in 1445 and to a lower extent the one in Bruges opened in the same period of time. From these accounting activities, we see the commercial organization set by great merchants and the way they were using their geographical position to negotiate the best price for the different products. Monetized barter was one of the bargaining possibilities for great merchants. Before going into depth, I would like to tell you briefly about both the words and expressions used by merchants when mentioning bartering operations, barter operations. In Salviati documentation, the words used are the same as those to be found in the handbooks, with monetized barter being identified or reported as simply as barter. Like in handbooks, we have monetized barter, which is a commercial operation which deals with exchanging one commodity with another, as we saw in the morning, but according to some specific agreement setting both upstream terms and conditions, and in particular prices and monetary equivalents between one commodity and the other. For economic players, barter is not the payment in kind which may follow the conclusion of the business, the end of the business, because the payment is reported in money and not in commodities. For example, we have an English cloth or wool account sent in 1457 for Bruges agency. This reports that the payment of some of the wool has been received in commodities. In the account received in Bruges by Bernardo de Bardi, we read that they had been paid in sheets coming from the Low Countries. Therefore, it is not a barter, but rather a payment in commodities. The different perception is the intention and the timing of the contract or agreement. Monetized barter corresponds to a complex negotiation, a very difficult and complex negotiation between two players. As for the vocabulary, we can add a little cultural note in the way this Florentine documentation in England allows us to explain the slow integration of such merchants abroad. We can see the language, the knowledge of the English language by these merchants. And for example, they tend to Italianize the English word by frequently mentioning barguegno instead of barter. They use barguegno as a word. Okay, let's move to the so-called Italian practice of barter. This kind of activity is part of a system made by the merchants of the peninsula throughout several centuries. As we all know, the Italian presence has been present for many centuries, and we always find these same families all over again. The long duration of their presence can be defined as institutions, real institutions like the presence of nations with their own rules, their organization and consul ruling them, but also some complex made up of all companies in the different European Mediterranean places. Italian historiography has made an effective use of quasi-city set by Giorgio Chittolini at the beginning of the 90s. This new word is very interesting from the logistic viewpoint. The protagonist of mercantile networks generating this quasi-institution set by the Italian presence abroad and the position as a player with specific powers. In order for us to examine the quasi-institution, Northern and Western Europe is a very important area showing integration and the maintenance in a foreign land of the elements coming from Italian economic and financial elite. I'm speaking of quasi-institution because the presence of Italian merchants abroad is based on formal elements, but especially not institutionalized. And to some extent, they characterize the society and they are part of its organization, both locally in the peninsula and abroad, without any juridical position. By following Jacques Rivel, we can define an institution as any, and I quote, any organization working regularly within society according to explicit and implicit rules, and it is supposed to meet some specific collective demand. In this way, BATA seems to be a very good starting point to understand both functioning and the presence of the Italian system at the end of Middle Ages. The London market benefits from the archives of Borromei Company, which has been recently studied by Francesco Guidi Truscoli and Jim Bolton, coming to London well before the Salviati family. The documents allow us to consider BATA as a very important structural element of the economic system led by Italian merchants, making it possible making the circulation of Mediterranean commodities and with Europe. For example, the players of the wool market are numerous and focused. Therefore, we can ask ourselves about the possibility of being part of this market. It was the same Italian companies all over again to be present on London and English market. For example, Girolamo Biscaro analyzing Borromei in London at the beginning of the 19th century or 20th century. And the system between Borromei, studying this system between Borromei in London and other families from Milano, in particular Ruffini in the 30s of the 15th century, showing that they were exchanging commodities coming from Flanders with wool coming from England. The Salviati documents also mention a similar system involving the very same players, both in Bruges and London. Therefore, 2.5 years after the official opening of Salviati agency in London, Salviati started to do business with Ruffini from Bruges, Ambrogio and Brothers, and we see the first transactions going back to July 1448, dealing with wool purchase of wool for the Ruffini that was sent to London, to Milano. The speaker is correcting himself. The commercial cooperation did not stop later, and we see Ruffini and Salviati doing business until 1458. But unfortunately, it was only in 1454 that monetized BATA started, taking advantage of the production of the two areas, English wool.
Prima di allora, probabilmente.
And the cloth. To assess the quality of their partner, Ruffini started to outsource commodities coming from the Flanders and differentiating the products required. This all happened between 1451 and 1453. During the following period, we see Salviati and Ruffini, and they start doing BATA. They start as Ruffini did with Borromeo. This shows that BATA is an activity where the trust between the two partners is important. The two societies decide to practice and to use BATA when they are convinced that the other partner is reliable and they can obtain better prices in their own spaces. It is also interesting to consider practical modality. Both companies, both Salviati and Borromei, have agencies both in Bruges and London. However, they would take advantage of such exchange to obtain cloth from another agency, an Italian agency in Bruges. We know that in time, Ruffini had to acquire a good skill in the sector of Flemish cloth, with the mutual trust relations with low regional operators. Okay, it's not just wool exchanged with other products. We also have cloth in London, one of the commodities exchanged for other products. We see the Italian peninsula and England. We see the cloth that would be from Essex that would be bartered with Tuscan cloth and especially silk. As we saw in the morning, these drapings were sent from a Florence agency via Pisa, the Salviati agency in Pisa, and they were to be sent to Merchant and Alderman in London. William Cantelow, when these silk drapings arrive, or drapes arrive, they're not being accepted, and therefore they are being sold by Salviati in London. But the change happens in a time when there were anti-Italian revolts or upheavals, guided particularly by the servants of these people, of this businessmen. The operation had long been planned, as is to be seen from Florentine books of Salviati family. The so-called Garbuli, xenophobic upheavals are not fostering barter, as we have seen in the letter that I have mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And such Garbuli do not provide peaceful exchange. This is also to be seen in a period where upheavals are still on the way in 1458, or protest. A letter about a barter between cloth and wool with Ruffini in Bruges is mentioning the money spent or the expense following the need to move these cloth from one place to their place. Moving the paintings. Such paintings had been bartered with the son of William Cantelow, Thomas, in March 1455, thanks to Ruffini's agreement, and they partner in Bruges, Pietro d'Arabatta. Barter also allowed to obtain the most important raw materials for production process, and so cloth were being exchanged with barbarian grains through the Iberian Peninsula before reaching England. As is frequently the case, we need to have an overall view to better understand all the steps involved into the transaction. The raw material belonging to Gerardo Gianfigliaschi from Florence, living in Valencia, was being bartered in London with different kinds of fabrics or cloth. In 1449, we see dyes, and they are immediately sold to a London tailor. We have Montivilliers cloth exchanged with dyes.
Come si evince dai registri di Bruges,
according to Bruges books, Salviati took advantage of their position
per ottenere altri materiali
to obtain other raw materials and products from our other region. In Bruges, for example, they were exchanging the products received from other areas in Europe with commercial partners like the agency in London. And in this way, the products coming from the Iberian Peninsula, like olive oil and iron, they were being exchanged with cloth coming from England and wool coming from Cotswold in England. In the same way, silk cloth, Florentine silk cloth, was being exchanged with silk provision. And then we have one last example that will help us to understand the entrepreneurial strategies of a Salviati company. Bruges agency was sending silk from Spain via Venice and Bologna to Florence agency that was sending it to a company, a silk in Florence as in exchange for silk drapes. Florentine drapes were then sent to Bruges. We see this selling of silk cloth produced in Florence, and thanks to this production, for example, we see them on the ambassador of the Duke of Milano, and the operation is finished with some little profit. Therefore, Spanish silk would allow the Neroni in Florence, another very important family, allies of the Salviati family, to obtain fabrics from London. We see that Florentine operators would work in the same way in all areas. For example, Sergio Tognetti has shown that in Naples, Florentine drapes were being exchanged with silk coming from Calabria. In the example about Salviati, we have seen that the circulation of Spanish silk was made possible by the dynamism of Florentine merchants, therefore from the Iberian Peninsula to Tuscany and to northern Western Europe. To finish up, we see, thanks to some accounts in London, we see how the calculation was being made. Barter would allow some payment in other ways. Thomas Canteloup and his family were very frequently working with the London agency, and the budget of accounts is not linear. The business between the two families, both Salviati and the English, are many. And if we take as an example the purchase of wool from Salviati with Thomas Canteloup, we see that, like other wool sellers, some cash was paid at the end of the transaction. And moreover, 3 years, it took 3 years to finish the transaction, and payment was made through compensation. Tommaso was also a client of the Ruffini in 1454, and for the payment, Tommaso was releasing bills of exchange, and the Salviati bought part of the wool, bartering it with the Flemish flax. This barter has been debated in the tavern because it is recorded, and the wine bought as the expense. So we see this whole mechanism which is being used in order for prices to coincide, the prices of the commodities involved, especially when they were expressed in different unit of measures from one area to the other. The Northern Western Observatory provides a vision of a barter in these areas and its structural character. And then it also provides a specific information on the different barter and the reflection of such a practice. The importance of barter in the business of great merchants shows that its use does not mean being primitive.
Catherine Vernat nota che il baratto fa
And barter is part of a highly monetized,
anche ovvio per il caso di questi operatori.
and also for the case of these international operators. If we examine this kind of activity, the use of barter is complicating the exchange on the market. It requires a precise calculation and some specific planning of exchange, as we see from the letters sent from German merchants in Venice, studied by Philipp Braunstein. Therefore, barter provides some view on the dexterity of economic operators. And with this example of English wool vis-à-vis cloth from the Flanders, Flemish cloth, and this is an example of barter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Matthieu, for this contribution, very inspiring and introducing us in the practice of the barter. And now we went on to our second speech of Anne Kucab, the Centre Roland Mounier de Paris. Anne will speak about alternative currencies in Rouen at the end of the Middle Ages. Please, Anne.
Rouen est dans la seconde moitié du XVe siècle.
In the second half of the 15th century, Rouen was the second city of the Kingdom of France. After the turmoil of the Hundred Years' War, the return to the authority of Charles VII in 1449 marked the beginning of an economic revival for the city. It then polarized a vast set of economic and social relations that we trace thanks to many sources preserved. The archival collection for the late Middle Ages are numerous and offer almost continuous series of registers. In my research, I examined many accounts from the urban and religious authorities. The latter, compared with municipal deliberation, narrative, iconographic, and archaeological sources, made it possible to chart the consumption and living standards of Rouen. The accounts are indeed the central source for this period, built in three parts: the receipts, the expenses or mise, and the receipts hoped for but not received. They detail the expenses, food, firewood, clothing, and let us determine the salaries and understand the transaction mechanisms. The precision of Rouen accounting sources make it possible to grasp the complexity and detail of these transactions, showing the regular use of alternative currencies that took several forms. These alternative currencies were used in the context of an employer-employee relationship, participated in a commercial transaction, or emphasized the symbolic dimension of the exchange. The use of the term alternative currencies is particularly relevant for Rouen, since they seem to be considered as such by the accountants themselves. Indeed, the accounts were kept in kinds of account. They were constructed into columns. The first column, the widest, contains details of expenditures and the revenue, while a second, smaller column summarizes the amounts in livres. However, it is interesting to note that payments in kind are included in the same way as currencies of account. This is particularly the case for the Archbishop of Rouen, who still receives certain cents and rents in kinds in the second half of the 15th century. These were not cereals or grains, but more anecdotal payments, which were then recorded in the same way as currencies in revenue and expenditures. This is the case of the heirs received by the Archbishop for the year 1454-55. At the end of this chapter, we find the total sum of these gelines, capons, and other payments in kind received by the Archbishop according to the same procedure and the same typography as for mainstream money. The use of the term alternative currency is therefore particularly appropriate in the case of Rouen. We will study more specifically three uses of alternative currencies at the end of the Middle Ages. In the first place, as we will examine alternative currencies in the context of an employment relationship, then we will question the use of these currencies in the context of commercial transactions. If the practice of salaried employment was almost widespread in the urban areas at the end of the Middle Ages, there were also alternative remunerations instead of, or in addition to such cash payments. This was particularly the case for works attached to an institution or a person. The concierge, the municipal hotel, was paid annually as the cook, the washerwoman, or the treasurer of the Archbishop in Rouen. Depending on their quality and the nature of their work, wages were more or less important. The participating clerics in the administration, such as the treasurer or the sealer of the Archbishop, received gages for more than £40, while the little hands, such as the laundry, the cook, or the groom, earned 28 and £12 per year. In addition, the wages there were staff These staff were fed, housed, and sometimes clothed. This alternative remuneration in kind is not to be neglected because it represented substantial sums. We have estimated that between 1453 and 1504, a member of the Archiepiscopal Hotel was fed on average for 12 deniers per day, to which must be added 4 or 5 deniers corresponding to drink. The staff and officers of the Archiepiscopal Hotel were therefore fed and watered for a minimum of 16 or 17 deniers per day, or more than £25 per year. This is not an income supplement, but a part of it paid in kind. By way of comparison, a simple worker in building earned £30 a year. This share can be explained by practical constraints. The Archbishop of Rouen thus easily used a share of the income he received in kind, which gave. The accounts also included that these revenues were given to the dépensiers of the hotel for current use. It happened that some officers of the hotel exception received part of the wages in the form of payment in kind, such as the spender of the Archiepiscopal Hotel, whose role was to ensure its stewardship. So the exception received part of the wages in form of payment in kind, such as the spender of the Archiepiscopal Hotel, whose role was to ensure its stewardship. His annual wages were usually £12, but in 1453-54, for some unknown reason, it was paid part in money and part in clothing. Both expenses are entered under the heading of deniers payés à cause des gains des officiers. He received only £7 of wages, to which must be added the cloth or the making of a dress, his lining, and the chaperone for an amount of £10. The spender was not worse off. In some cases, the alternative payment corresponding to a working tool, as can be seen in the case of Michaud Faroul, who was paid 16 écus each month. To each horse was added annually. The payment of the horse is justified as follows in the accounts. Un cheval par un pour se tenir en la cour de roi fin, etc. en Old French. Some workers of the Archiepiscopal Hotel were paid entirely by alternative currencies. We have identified two logics at work. It can be a punctual worker or performing small jobs who does not receive wages in money, as is the case of Jean de Lille, for which the account explicitly specifies. Pour une chose, pour gérant des Lille, lesquels, etc. Wage remuneration all in kind may also have been the mark of a transitional status of an apprentice. Thus, for several years, since 1445, the Archbishop of Rouen employed a young kitchen assistant named the Little Robinet in the accounts. This one was probably very young because there was also mention for his father, who came to pick him up when he fell ill. It is specified that he did not receive wage but a clothing set composed according to the years of a dress, purse, a pair of shoes, a chaperone, and shoes. The total amount of these garments gradually increased from 2 to 14 pounds, sous 9 deniers in the first year of work, from 71 to 1,461. This is less than the wages received by the other servants of the hotel, such as the washerwoman and the cook, who received between 10 and 12 pounds of wages. This remuneration clearly seems to mean the Robinet was in training, which justifies that he did not receive a salary in money. The remuneration in real currency had intervened with the qualification. We find confirmation with the count of the year 1462-63. Robinet still appears there, but he is then designated as a cook and receives 12 pounds. Another petit queue was then hired and received a salary in the form of 4 pairs of shoes. In this case, alternative currencies are the hallmark of apprentice status, while cash payment occurs when the worker is seen as qualified. There is also a concomitance between the money pledges and the use of surname Benel in the account, since Robinet was only referred to by his first name, as long as he was paid in kind. Alternative currencies were therefore used in Rouen in the context of work, and particularly for the example study for the pledged workers. The latter were felled and water, which represent a significant part of this remuneration. Depending on their status, alternative currency may account for some or all of their payment. This use of this type of currency is explained by the desire to provide a work tool, horse, or pay for one-off work or work done by an apprentice, clothing. In addition, alternative currencies were involved in various commercial transactions, as we know from sources. We observed the use of alternative currencies in commercial transactions. Simple barters, object against object or object against service, are almost absent from grand sources. On the other hand, there are some mentions of transactions involving a sharing currency and one sharing alternative currency. The latter reveals the great ability of men and women for the Middle Ages to estimate the value of things in order to balance transactions. The principal commercial barter is based on the equivalence between the goods exchanged. It is therefore necessary that they to be of the same value so that none of the parties is harmed, which explains the existence of supplementary money to reach the required value was necessary. The barter was therefore unbalanced between is why some money was added. So these principal commercial parties based on the equivalence between the goods exchange, it is therefore necessary that they to be of the same value so that none of the parties harmed, which explains the existence of the supplementary money to reach the required value if necessary. For instance, it was sometimes necessary during visits to the dioceses of the ecclesiastical province to exchange a tired horse for a more dashing one. The barter was therefore unbalanced, which is why a sum of money was added to the old horse, as in 1459-1460. A few years earlier, the account even talks about the troche d'un cheval in the same circumstances. There were sometimes disagreements about the fairness of the transaction, which led to conflicts. In the summer of 1498, two merchants did business at the Pentecost Fair. The first, Bernard de Recourt, a Parisian wine merchant, provided 43 ponchons. A one man named André Grandchamp, who gave him in exchange lead, the scarlet sheet of 17 urn and a blanchet from England, and the rest in coins. The matter could have been ended here, but one of these two merchants contested the transaction on the ground that it was unfair and submitted the matter to the city council, which heard several witnesses to determine the validity of the transaction and correct it. This example highlights the common nature of these mixed transactions for this. Some transactions involve reuse and recovery, particularly for building materials. In this case, it is specified that the raw materials were supplied by the client, by the operator, but the operator had to retrieve them himself. The sum provided in the form of material was then subtracted from sum due, as we can see, for the repair of the gutter of the Archbiscopal Hotel, which was made in new lead and lead remelted. In this case, out of 102 pounds of lead needed, only 24 pounds of new lead needed to be purchased, the rest being provided by the Archbishop. The amount spent corresponds to the purchase price of 44 pounds of lead at the average marketplace. The use of material as money can complicate transactions, as we see with an example from 1454-1455. And so we have this lead being paid. This use of material as money can complicate transaction, as I said. These two plumbers said that to rework the lead in the form of tablets so that it could be reused. The Archbishop Wren provided them with the old one, which was scrupulously weighted under the aegis of the Viscount of Water. Plumbers were paid only for the resigned work, since the materials were provided. The amount of lead to be remelted and recovered was estimated at 1,592 pounds. The plumbers therefore received 26 pounds and 4 sous in money, and 2 pounds 2 sous and 98 in the form of all lead. This balance separation, particularly frequent in the field of construction, can be emphasized. Thus, in 1467, the woodcarver Paul Moselman, who worked and was housed by a cathedral chapter, died at the plague, leaving rent areas. An agreement was made with his widow, to whom the chapter owed money for the sculpture of the pulpits made by her husband, but not yet paid. The same logic seems to be at work with two painters' brothers, Gerald and Jacques Bouloux, who gave up the 30 sous of salary owed to them by the Fabrique of the Church of Saint Vincent. Favoring the use of alternative currency was not only a question of pragmatism or lack of cash, but also as a symbolic value. The object used as an alternative currency thus recalls the nature of the transaction. For instance, the ropemakers Rouen rented the city, the path located along the rampart, to make their rope. They paid the rent in exchange. This included a silver part, one part in kind. The rope here seems to recall the profession and the object of the rental. The symbolic charge was multiplied in the context of donation and gratuities that were most often made in alternative currencies. Indeed, forms of rewards happened several times in the lives of workers. They manifested the satisfaction of the sponsors and were integrated in rituals. For example, during the end of a building process, the various workers involved could be rewarded with gifts. The practice appear in the accounts, since the treasurers bought them to be able to offer them. It was therefore not a problem of liquidity, but the desire to materialize the transaction by means of gifts that played the role of alternative currency. Wine gifts in particular were frequent when concluding a contract, the wine of the market, but also when the building was finished. Wine being an expensive drink, its gift to workers materialized their success. However, there was a variety of gratuities that sometimes extending to the relatives of the recipients. This was the case of 1453-54, where we have these beer, we have these wine. And there is a French quotation now. The amounts spent depended on the quality of the recipient and the work done, then signified recognition for the work done or the service rendered by the payers. In this situation, too, it is relevant to speak of alternative currency, since these gratuities in kind were increasingly monetized in the second half of the 15th century. Payers replaced the gratuity in kind with a sum of money. It is interesting to note that the symbolic charge of these gifts was retained in the title and description of the account entry. The sum of money given was expressly presented as replacing the sheep of the Ascension or wine. Gifts or a donation are more difficult to classify. Unlike gratuities, they did not undergo monetarization during the 15th century, probably to keep the symbolic charge, but they carry it. The Archbishop of Rouen and the municipality frequently offered meals or drinks to the various prestigious representatives who visited the city, and in particular to the king's representatives. For instance, the surgeons Rouen offered a double cap to each of the examiner. This gift associated the entry into the profession underlined the symbolism of the headgear in which the wearers honorably resided. There was also hierarchy in textile donation. Pieces of clothing, dresses, shoes, chaperones were often given to workers, while pieces of cloth were generally offered to elites. These phenomena, also observed by Thomas Roy, was obviously in Rouen, where the urban authorities did not hesitate to offer pieces of luxury sheets. In fact, concerning donation mechanisms, goods and services could have the function similar to cash. It was collected in particular for donations made to the church as part of the economy of salvation, under the form of money, rents, real estate properties, but also clothing and textile, like Nicolas de la Rue, who donated in 1486 to the parish of Saint-Étienne. To conclude, the Rouen accounts made it possible to grasp the divisive use of alternative currencies at the end of the Middle Ages. The sources showed that these practices were not anecdotal, but were instead seen as real possibility in the context of transaction that could be complex and combined alternative currencies, account currencies, and cash. These alternative currencies were used by several groups, by different social groups in the context of employer-employee relationship, business and transaction gifts or gratuities. They appear very clearly in the accounts in the same way as money expressed in coins or in currencies of account. when we examine the value in relation to the most frequent wages, we see that they were not secondary currencies or of lesser value, but rather possible means of payment. The use of these currencies in sometimes comes transaction, therefore underlines the great ability of men and women of middle ages to estimate the value of things and establish equivalences or compensations. This conversion gymnastic was relatively widespread in the urban environments of the Middle Ages. The use of alternative currencies is displaying of practical issues, making use materials profitable, revenue in kind, avoiding payments in coins, but also in some cases by their symbolic value. Thank you.
Merci bien, cher Anne. Thank you very much for your very detailed contribution presenting us Rouen as a case study for the use of alternative currencies. So I think we should have a short coffee break of a quarter of an hour, and we will meet us here at 4 o'clock exact, please. And this is also the time to fill in the formula for the discussion. Thank you very much. It was perfect in time. Perfect. Are there any other questions, comments to both speakers? Or do I have all the formulas? So it is. Then we will start with the contribution of Matthieu. And the first question, I think for both, is from Corinne Maid.
Parlerò in italiano.
I'm going to speak English. I'm going to speak Italian. So a reflection, just hearing this morning the words of Francesco and Matthieu this afternoon. If I got you right, the barter is not a sign of economic delay. I was asking, what about the money? The money, was that a paradoxical way of some economic delay? I don't know. Currency. Can we say currency is used with people we do not know, we never met? So you said, I don't remember the names because they started bartering after a few years of knowledge because you have to use the currency when you don't know the people, you never met these people. And also we use the currency for those not belonging to international networks, or maybe people not having the necessary information to trust the person before them to see if barter is going to be useful or not, and safe above all. So the use of currency must be reconsidered. This was a sort of back thought, a sort of reflection of mine, not for your paper, but also for the previous papers before yours. And the second question about barter was, so many years ago, some years ago, I got through the correspondence of a small shopkeeper in Livorno that made woolen caps in Prato, these woolen caps, and so headgears. And they tried to sell these headgears, these caps, at the end of the 18th century in the Leghorn market. With, merchants more important than him. And what I've seen, sometimes he was obliged to take these goods as a barter for his caps or headgears. So in the cases you study, there are ways of a sort of mandatory barter between merchants of different levels, because these wants to vend, to sell his caps, and is obliged to accept an importer qua, whatever. So that's mandatory. So can you elaborate on this idea of barter as a mandatory transaction? And the last questions for Anna. It is not a question, but I want just to insist on something. On the symbolic value of goods in kind, symbolic value, because you see, so the money equivalent, what comes in kind, what comes in kind, but the symbolic value of payment in kinds, that's quite important also for salary payments.
Thank you very much. And Matthieu, please allow me also to have a question. So far as I know, were the Salviati one of the merchant bankers in the late Middle Ages and early modern times who had one of the best and most elaborate bookkeeping. And my question is, are there any special signs to show that something is done by barter? How is it designed in the lectures that it is not a normal business, a normal transfer, but a barter transfer? So, and now the floor is open for you.
Allora, per la prima domanda,
Well, for the first question, you're right, yeah, totally right. So the use of currency and barter or accounts to set up the accounts, it depends on the context. In London, they need cash to buy wool. For those being merchants, when they have a lot of businesses, different types of trade, they stop using currency. When they have several types of trades, they try to save money because they need money to buy goods. And money comes thanks to the ecclesiastical benefits. The UK people pay in cash, so that's the entire loop. And when it's possible, they barter. But as you've seen, barter entails some costs. If the international scenario changes, so stocking goods is going to be expensive. Selling miles of silk, as Francesco said, over many years, so this requires a lot of stuff. So currency is going to be used when we do not know people before you, when you have no friendship or any kind of relationship to the people in front of you. Above all, the English do that. The other question about the Salviati. In Salviati, I didn't see any form of mandatory, compulsory barter, but in Treviso, payments, yes. Payment, I've seen payments. A draper, a maker, a weaver. So the weavers, the drape makers pay in kind, not in cash. They give drapes for work done, and weavers, yes. But they can't sell with the rate I got. Instead of a big merchant, so the employers give some expired goods or poor or low quality goods to those needing their payment, or difficult to sell out. In the bookkeeping, in Salviati bookkeeping, they wrote wool bartered with, etc., 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 etc. This has been always written down. And then we have the payment, which was not foreseen, payment in commodities. But always written down the operations when this has been bartered, wool versus iron or whatever this might be. Thank you.
Now we are coming to the questions to the paper of Anne. The first is Marianne, please.
In most of my comments, I'm talking about how England is different. That is not the case. Everything you describe is exactly as I would have found it in medieval accounts, household accounts of nobles, of bishops, urban accounts. There was nothing different. There was one thing that's slightly different. One of the things that most struck me is that you had a passing mention to the steward of the Archbishop, the steward of the hotel of the Archbishop of Rouen, who gets a salary, but also gets clothing. And that in England is extremely common. Every major household official of an archbishop, of a noble, of royalty, always would get a salary plus clothing. And the word that we use is livery for that. And it's very, very common. And I was curious, you didn't use the word livery, and it may be that it was just you're nodding, so maybe you've come across this as well. It's very common. The thing that was not common is the horse. I have never, ever seen anybody get a horse at that household official level. So that was, I mean, I'm sure maybe it was just a one-off, I'm not sure. So it's really more of an observation than a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And now, Robert, please.
Merci Anne pour la belle présentation. Une question, bien évidemment, ça m'intéresse.
Thank you very much, Anne, for your presentation, a brilliant presentation. You analyzed accounts and you also spoke about servants. My question is, did you have the chance to find in these accounts
Et notamment la question de la nourriture. Je suppose que les domestiques, ils ont été nourris.
the servants that have been hired, and then for food, servants were supposed to eat. It is very typical for servants
Ça, pour moi, c'est encore très flou dans différents.
or home servants. The situation is not very clear, actually. You need that hiring practice or is difficult. Because you mentioned some rulings in the city. They tried to regulate the hiring activity as well as wages, hiring activity. It is the end of the century. My question is, do you have any details about this kind of ruling? Did you see any change in the behavior vis-à-vis accounts, for example?
Now, Madame Coquille, s'il vous plaît.
Je me rends compte que ma question rejoint celle de Corinne.
My question goes back to Corina's. You mentioned the positive side
Subordination ou
and the gratuities. What about obligations? For example, spices. I don't know this topic very well. But they were almost obliged to give something like that. This is what we see. It's like a bribery today. It looks like bribery today.
Last but not least, Jacob, please.
Okay, thanks, Anne. It's always great fun to learn about medieval accounts from outside the Low Countries, my area of expertise. So I have two questions, and they basically will reveal, in part, my ignorance and also reflects, to a certain extent, the fact that, well, you managed to get a lot of words in a very brief period of time, so compliments to the interpreter. So the first question is, whenever I see these, well, payments in kind, and indeed sometimes quite surprising things pop up in accounts, the question that comes to mind is this something that reflects the age when the account was created, or is this something that goes back to centuries before? Because I've also seen these things where the city will hand out a salmon or a fat pig to a certain organization in Europe. If you retrace this, quite often it turns out that this is something that has been practiced for many centuries and that originates in a completely different era. So I was just wondering to what extent the examples you are given reflects the situation in second half of the 15th century Rouen, or are in fact petrified practices from much earlier. The second question is, to what extent the treasury of the archbishopry was ever in possession of cash, of coins? I know from my city governments in Holland, they usually had zero access or hardly any access to cash. So everything they did was done using credit. And if, well, your organization also was always strapped for cash, I could in part also imagine that these payments in kind would make sense. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please, Anne.
Alors, je vais répondre dans l'ordre des questions. Donc, effectivement, je suis d'accord avec Corinne.
I agree with Corinne vis-à-vis the symbolic value of commodities and the value in kind. We should be asking ourselves about that. The fact of having monetized gratuities during 15th century but not gifts, this shows that they have a huge symbolic value. As for hiring practice of home servants, it is not very clear in the rulings, but actually there is some daily hiring practice by the Archbishop of the Council of the Cathedral, the capital of the Cathedral, the chapter of the Cathedral. And for these daily workers, there is no gratuity with food. Sometimes they receive fruit or wine. But in municipal rulings, there is no regulation vis-à-vis hiring practice. At the beginning of the 16th century, there was a ruling aimed at fighting against poverty and unemployment. At the beginning of the 16th century, there is a ruling, but in Middle Ages there is still nothing about hiring practice. So we can see if something changes. There is some monetization in the second half of the 15th century. We see some pears, wine, apples in the first half. In the second half of the century, they receive money. Therefore, the behavior is changing. Payment is changing. There is a difference between the first and the second half of the century. Going back to the question by Katia, gratuities in spices, we have two typical cases. The servants of the Archbishop receive some spices, and this is part of the wage in kind. These gifts are not given by the Archbishop. They depend on the connection with the chapter of the cathedral. This is not a way to have some subordinate work. There is a peculiar case in the second half of the 15th century. The chapter of the cathedral wants to rebuild, and there is a catastrophic event for 20 years. In order for workers to be motivated, they are being given spices, pears every 3 weeks. In order for them to finish the work in the site, because they didn't want to continue this work in the site. This was also a way for encouraging workers in a very difficult situation. As for the last question, the treasury of the Archbishop and the access to silver and money and cash. The Archbishop would pay in cash. Therefore,
isoler les différentes pièces de monnaie.
Some cases have been made and bags to put money, and the Duke of Burgundy is too close to the king. Therefore, some instructions are being given in order for the coins to be properly hidden to avoid any stealing. Therefore, they feared that this money, this cash would be or plundered. Therefore, it is a safety measure.
Okay.
Peut-être revenir du coup effectivement sur.
I'd like to go back to the topic of books. And therefore receiving clothing to look good enough vis-à-vis, for example, the chef. There was a very interesting case of the cook. 12
pour une raison qui m'échappe un peu.
12 pounds, and the rest is in money. Therefore, the wage is divided. Part of it is clothing, and part of it is money. The organization of accounting provides all this. There is a chapter, a specific chapter on expenses, the expenses for clothing. It is a way to complete the payment, the wage. Therefore, it is separate from the rest. This has to be considered separately.
Any other questions or comments from the auditory? Nothing? Nothing else? So it is, okay. Then it's time to say thank you very much. I would like to thank, first of all, our two speakers, Anne and Matthieu, all the discussants, and last but not least, the whole auditory for being here. Thanks you so much. Enjoy the evening and see you tomorrow. Thanks.
Comment 1400, je peux te retrouver à 1465 ou un truc comme ça. C'est une résurgence de la Grande Peste.